Welcome back everyone to another NASCAR Heat 5 setup video. Today's video takes us to Michigan International Speedway, a track that in real life used to be absolutely amazing. Grooves all the way from the white line at the bottom or even below onto the apron all the way up to the outside wall and everywhere in between. Unfortunately, since the most recent repave, it has been a terrible racetrack in real life. But here in NASCAR Heat 5, it is known for extreme speed. You can run this track, at least on new tires, either wide open or very close to it. It leads to some really fun racing if you can get the handling right. And of course, that's what we're here for today. So let's get started. Before we get into the setup discussion, there's a few other pieces of information that I wanted to pass along. First, be sure to check out the video I did talking about NASCAR Heat 4 setups in NASCAR Heat 5. In the video, I talk about whether or not these Heat 4 setups work in Heat 5, and also my approach to setups in NASCAR Heat 5. Next, let's talk about tire wear settings. I generally work with normal settings, so normal wear and normal tire wear fall off. And the reason I do that is so that we can get a very good baseline, which is the most important thing for me to pass along to you guys. That way, if you're using more aggressive tire wear settings, more wear, less grip as the tires wear, then you'll know that you need to tighten the car up some in order to save the tires, in particular the right rear. If you're using less aggressive settings, which would be less tire wear, more grip in the tires as they wear, then you know that you can get by with running a little bit looser setup. So using normal settings for both tire wear as well as grip fall off allows me to create that baseline. I do enjoy using the other settings, particularly having the more aggressive settings and less grip as the fall off happens, but I think normal on both tire wear and fall off gives us a very good baseline. Also, the focus of my setups is on stability. I don't focus so much on single lap speed or worry about single lap qualifying type speed. I'm more interested in the race and having a good car from the beginning of the run through the middle of the run, and then finishing up the run strong as the fuel wears out. And then finally, when I'm doing setups for both Cup, Xfinity, as well as the trucks, I like to keep these as close to each other as possible so that it gives the same feel across all three series. In general, Xfinity and trucks run a little bit tighter for me using the same setup as I would use in the Cup cars. So in general, I'm going to loosen those up just a little bit in order to get the identical feel that I have with Cup. So with that out of the way, let's move into the setup. A couple of quick things I want to point out before we jump into the setup discussion. First and foremost, because of my limited time right now, I have had no time at all to run either the Xfinity or the trucks. No practice laps, no racing, no anything. However, I didn't really feel like that was going to be a major issue because if you've been following me for any length of time, not only in NASCAR Heat 5, but also Heat 4 and so on, then you'll know that these setups translate very well among all three of the top series. So whatever adjustments you normally make going from Cup to Xfinity or Cup to truck, I have no doubt are going to work just fine here at Michigan. So with that out of the way, the other thing I want to point out is that obviously the normal adjustments that I talk about in each and every video on how to loosen the car or tighten the car, control the rotation, all those things, they all still apply here. However, for today's video, I'm going to focus on one area of the car, and that is the left front spring, and we're going to focus on how you can use it and it alone with adjustments to loosen or tighten the car and how that will affect ultimately your tire wear and your speed. As we all know, the goal here that I talk about in each of these videos is to give you a balanced setup with regards to tire wear. And that specifically means the right front to right rear and how those two tires wear in relation to each other, but also the left sides as well, but to a much lesser extent. Here at Michigan, it is very difficult to get any speed without leaning heavily on that right rear tire. So the setup, as we are looking at it, lacks a little bit of speed, but we're going to talk about how you can add some of that back in, and then you can adjust from there based on how your tires are wearing and ultimately the balancing act you have to play of tire wear versus speed. So with that in mind, let's hop directly into the shocks. Ultimately, for the shocks, I decided on 10s across the board with one exception that we'll talk about momentarily. The reason for that is I like to keep things fairly standard. I don't like to get too aggressive in either direction, if at all possible, on the shocks. And of course, I really also don't like to go into great detail on each individual corner of the car for the release setup. That's more of a personal preference. So 10s across the board works very well. However, I will mention that my personal preference here at Michigan is to go higher with these numbers. I would generally want to be somewhere around the 15 range, somewhere between 13 and about 17. Really works well for me. Reason being, I prefer quicker reactions out of the car. I want the car to react quicker to my steering inputs, quicker to my throttle inputs, whether I'm backing off the throttle or applying more throttle. I prefer the quicker reactions here at Michigan because you're in the throttle so much and so aggressively. I like that quicker reaction. However, if you prefer slower reactions, you want the car to be maybe a little bit more stable and not react quite as quickly to your steering inputs or throttle or brake inputs, then try dropping these numbers to somewhere around 7 or 5 or even lower and see how that works for you and which area you prefer. Some of you will prefer something around the 10, sort of a middle ground. Some of you will prefer much higher, others much lower. So it's very much a personal feel type of setting. Moving on to the weight settings. We want maximum left side weight because we're on an oval. The front weight is at 52.0, which is fairly standard for me at this point, simply because I have found that it works very well for me. You want the minimum front weight that you can have while still keeping some stability in the car. Obviously, the final amount of front weight you're going to use will determine on what you're doing in the rest of the setup. So there is no right or wrong here. It's all based on what you're using for springs and sway bars and so on. But 52.0 works well for me. However, if the car is just too loose, it's just rotating too much overall, then I'll increase this number to something like 52.5 or even higher, and that will add some more stability to the car and slow down the overall rotation. Moving on to the wedge, 51.0 was a very good baseline for me. If I wanted to add some more speed to the car, then I needed the car to be looser, and dropping the wedge number to something like 50.5 or even lower will certainly add some speed to the car because it lets the car rotate a little bit quicker going through the corner. I find that particularly helpful at a track like Michigan where you're in the throttle so much, particularly on newer tires. However, if you find that the car is just over-rotating too much, the speed of the rotation in the car is just too much, then increase the wedge number to something like 51.5, 52.0, and so on. That's going to stabilize the car and slow down the speed of that rotation and allow you a little bit more comfort. Moving on now to the spring settings. This is an area where I think if you had to choose one area of the car where you say, look, all I'm going to do is adjust this one thing, here, make it the left front spring. Normally, we don't talk a great deal about the left front spring, so here, we're going to change that at Michigan. So we'll come back to that in just a second. Right front spring maxed out at 1,200 pounds. The reason I do that is because I like that steady platform. The maximum right front spring gives you something to lean against as you're going through the corner. If you decrease the right front spring, that's going to allow the car to rotate. It's going to make it looser, particularly on corner entry and through the center. So it's increasing that rotation overall. But I like to use the 1,200 pounds here simply because it gives me the feel that I'm looking for. A little bit tighter feel on entry, so I have better control. In the rear of the car, 50 pounds of split between the left rear and right rear. And you can see the right rear is at the maximum 600 pounds. That's because I want a stiffer feel overall. The lower the spring values you use, the more the car will want to roll, particularly on the entry of the corner. And it slows down the rotation of the car, and it can add some instability depending on some other factors that you have in the setup. But for me, maximum rear spring, particularly in the right rear, really helps the car to rotate. So if you find that the car is just too loose overall, then you can either increase the left rear spring or decrease the right rear, or do both. The closer you get these two springs to each other, the tighter the car is going to feel, particularly from the center of the corner on exit. So keep that in mind when you're making your adjustments. Now let's move back to that left front spring. I started out testing, once I sort of dialed in the setup where I wanted it, I moved the left front spring all the way down to the minimum of 400 pounds. That really is going to tighten up the car overall, particularly on the entry. So that means I had to back up the corner and get out of the gas a little bit earlier on the entry of the corner than I might otherwise prefer. So that took some speed out of it. However, it used a little bit more right front tire and a little bit less right rear tire. So it's an excellent way to adjust the tire wear settings and loosen or tighten the car by using simply the left front spring. As you can see, I decided finally on 600 pounds for the release setup, but by no means is that going to be the fastest way. The higher you go on the left front spring, the more speed you're going to dial into the car, because you're going to allow the left front to work harder on corner entry and allow that car to turn more. So more speed by increasing that left front, but of course that's also going to mean that you're going to use a little bit less right front and a little bit more right rear, so you're going to introduce more tire wear to that right rear. So keep that in mind. More speed usually equals more right rear tire wear. So with that in mind, let's move on now to the tire settings. 19 and 21 on the lefts, 50 and 48 on the rights. I usually like to use a little bit higher number on the left rear than the left front. That's usually anywhere from a half pound to a full pound. Here, it's a little bit more simply because I'm using pretty stiff springs in the rear of the car, and we're relying on the rear of the car overall to turn and give us more speed. So a little bit higher in the left rear, but as always, there's plenty of room for adjustability. When in doubt, I try to go a little bit under inflated as opposed to optimum inflation, just to give me a little bit better feel. But as always, that is a very individual characteristic of the car. What you'll find on the tires is overall, the higher numbers you use, you'll get a little bit more speed on the straightaway because you're reducing the rolling resistance. But lowering these numbers will give you a little bit better feel, a little bit more stability going through the corners overall. Moving on now to the miscellaneous settings. Camber is at 3.5 degrees, plus 3.5 on the left front, minus 3.5 on the right front. I actually tested going much higher than this on both corners, and it worked out very well. It did not have any negative effects on tire wear. However, I'd be very careful with the left front in particular, because you're already relying quite a bit on that. Definitely depending on what you're using for the left front spring. The higher you go on the left front spring, the more you're going to wear that particular corner of the car. So be careful there, but I was able to choose much higher on the right front camber, up around -5, and it worked perfectly fine. Ultimately, however, I prefer somewhere around -3 to -4. Somewhere in that range is where I try to stay. So we're right in the center of that at 3.5. Front sway bar maxed out at 2.0. Reason for this, I wanted a very sturdy platform for this track. Again, we are in the throttle a lot here at Michigan. Even on worn tires, you're still on the throttle quite a bit. So I wanted a nice and sturdy platform. The higher number you use on the front sway bar, that's going to add stability to the car, but it's also going to tighten the car up. The car's not going to want to rotate as much. So that's why we have some of the more aggressive spring settings or lower wedge numbers and so on to help this car rotate, along with the track bar that we'll get to momentarily. So if you want to help the car rotate overall and you want to use the sway bar for that, then drop the sway bar. But I would caution you against going more than 1 to 2 clicks on this, because this is a major adjustment to the car. Lowering that front sway bar will definitely help the car to rotate, but it can also make the car unstable unless you adjust some other parts of the setup to go along with that. Moving on now to the track bar, and we are maxed out on the left side and not much below that on the right side. Again, using the maximum front sway bar as well as very little split in the rear springs means that we need a way to help the car rotate. And we're doing that in part with the track bar being maxed out or very close to it. The general rule of thumb for the track bar is the higher it is overall, the looser the car will be, the more the car will want to rotate. On the left side of the track bar, the higher you have that, the more the car will want to rotate on corner entry. So it makes the car looser on corner entry. Lower numbers on the left side will tighten the car on corner entry. The right side is used mostly for the exit of the corner. So higher numbers here are going to loosen the car from the center of the corner on exit. Lower numbers are going to tighten the car on exit. So that's the way I use it, and why I try to make in this case, the left side a little bit higher than the right side, because I'm trying to save that right rear tire a little bit over the course of a full run. But again, raise that right side track bar and you certainly have the possibility of adding some speed because you're loosening up the car. Brake bias isn't really a huge issue here because I don't really use it unless I'm in big time traffic with the AI. So 75 is a pretty good default number. I generally like to keep it somewhere between 70 and 75 by default. And then if I need to, at somewhere like a short track where I'm going to be using more brake, I might go a little bit lower than 70, somewhere around 67, 66, 68, somewhere in that range. Every once in a while, I'll go a little bit higher. Again, just depending on personal preference. But 75 is sort of in the middle for me to the upper end of the range. Grill tape at 45% worked pretty well. Again, major thing with grill tape is just make sure you don't get the engine overheating. 45, maybe not as high as you could go. You might get by with 50, maybe a touch higher, because this is not something I spend a great deal of time on because it doesn't have a big effect in the game. So just don't get the engine overheating. You should be fine. Wheel lock and steering offset are at my defaults of 10 degrees and 0.05. The wheel lock is a great way to adjust the steering of the car. If you want quicker steering out of the car, you want a quicker response out of your steering inputs, then increase this number from 10 degrees up to somewhere around 16 or 18 or even higher, and it's going to accomplish that goal. However, if you want the steering inputs to be, or the response to your steering inputs to be less, so that you have to put more wheel into it, then lower this number to somewhere around 6 to 8, and that will certainly be a big difference as opposed to some of the higher values. Steering offset, 0.05 works well for me. It allows me to turn to the right a little bit on the straightaways just to hold the car straight, but not a huge amount. The higher the number you use on the steering offset, the more the car will want to go straight on the straightaway. However, you get that number too high, it can actually start to turn to the right on the straightaway, and that is certainly not something that you want on an oval. So you can certainly dial in more steering offset than I use, but this is a great value for me to get started. Moving on now to the gear settings. Did not touch first through third because those are pretty much exactly where I would want to place them by default. Rear end ratio, as always, there's a lot of adjustability. 325 will allow you to turn quite a bit of RPM, particularly when you are in traffic. We all know that at a place like Michigan where the draft becomes a huge factor, then your lap times are going to vary greatly depending on whether you are part of a draft or whether you're running by yourself. So that's going to have a lot to do with which gear you ultimately run. 325 has me running a lot of gear, but it doesn't quite have me maxing out and hitting the rev limiter extremely hard. So it leaves me a little bit of room there for when I get into heavy traffic and maybe get a big run without running out of RPMs. However, doesn't necessarily mean it is the fastest gear to use. There is plenty of adjustability there to reduce this down to maybe somewhere around 310, and that will give you a little bit more top end without running quite as many RPMs. Also keep in mind that the rear end ratio is another way to adjust the handling of the car. The higher the number you use on the rear end ratio, for example, if I go up to 333 or a 340 gear, that's going to turn more RPM, which is going to make the car looser under throttle because the engine is turning harder. Now, if we reduce this to something like a 310 or even lower, that's going to drop the RPMs. It's going to make the car tighter under throttle. So it is another way to adjust the handling of the car without touching springs and shocks and so on. So once again, I'll mention that I did not touch the Trucks or Xfinity here, but I don't really see that as being a big issue. Normally the things I would adjust going to Xfinity or Trucks is a way to loosen up the car a little bit. Also, the rear end ratio is one of those because the speeds are a little different. Sometimes you're going to have to make adjustments here, but other than that, everything should be fairly close as you move among the top 3 series. So that's going to do it for today. Thank you so much for joining me, and stay tuned for more NASCAR Heat 5.